I'll never forget the winter of 2023. January in the Midwest can be brutal, but this one felt different. The cold wasn't just cold, it was oppressive, like the air itself wanted to crush you. The snow piled higher than I'd ever seen, and the winds howled like living things, screaming through the trees. People stayed indoors. Nobody wanted to risk the roads or face the biting cold. And maybe that's why what happened went unnoticed for so long. It started with the power outages. They hit sporadically across town, leaving entire neighborhoods in darkness for hours. At first, it seemed like just another winter inconvenience. But then people started to disappear. Not many at first. A man who lived alone at the edge of town. A family whose house was buried so deep in snow you couldn't see the windows. Nobody thought much of it. It was easy to lose track of people when everyone was hunkered down. But I noticed. My name's Eric, and I work for the local utility company. My job is to respond to outages, checking transformers, power lines, and generators. That January, I was pulling long shifts, driving through endless snow and ice, trying to keep the lights on for everyone. And that's how I stumbled onto it. It was a Friday night when I got the call. A blackout had hit a cluster of houses on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where driveways are half a mile long and neighbors are few and far between. I loaded up my truck and headed out, the snow crunching under my tires as the headlights cut through the swirling white. The house was dark when I arrived, a 2-story farmhouse buried in drifts. I grabbed my flashlight and headed to the backyard, where the main line connected to the transformer. It didn't take long to find the problem. The wires were slashed clean through, not chewed by animals or broken by the wind. Cut, deliberately. A chill ran through me, and it wasn't just the cold. I radioed it in, but the static was so bad I couldn't get through. I decided to knock on the door, let the homeowners know what I'd found. The porch steps were buried in snow, and I had to wade through waist-deep drifts to reach the door. I knocked. No answer. Knocked again. Still nothing. Something about the silence made my skin crawl. I tried the doorknob, and to my surprise, it turned. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside, calling out, "Hello?" Anyone home? The house was freezing, colder than it should have been, even with the power out. My breath fogged in the air as I moved through the darkened rooms. Everything looked normal at first. Furniture neatly arranged, family photos on the walls, a half-empty cup of coffee on the kitchen table. But then I saw the footprints. They were faint, barely visible in the thin layer of frost that had settled on the hardwood floor. Bare feet, leading from the kitchen to the basement door. My flashlight beam shook as I followed them, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and leave. But I couldn't. I had to know. The basement door was ajar, and the footprints disappeared into the darkness below. I called out again, my voice echoing off the walls. "Hello? Is anyone down there?" No answer. Just the sound of the wind rattling the windows upstairs. I took a deep breath and descended the stairs, the old wood creaking under my boots. The basement smelled damp and earthy, like soil and decay. My flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing shelves lined with jars, an old workbench, and a washing machine in the corner. And then I saw it. In the center of the room, the floor had been dug up, leaving a gaping hole in the concrete. The dirt was fresh, dark and wet, as if it had been dug recently. A shovel leaned against the wall, its blade caked with mud. My stomach turned. I stepped closer, shining my flashlight into the hole. It was deep, at least 6 feet, and at the bottom I saw something pale. I leaned in, squinting, trying to make it out. That's when I heard the sound, a low, guttural growl coming from behind me. I spun around, the flashlight beam darting wildly across the room. At first, I saw nothing, just shadows and shelves. But then one of the shadows moved. It stepped into the light and my heart stopped. It was human, or at least it had been. Emaciated, with skin so pale it was almost translucent, stretched tight over sharp bones. Its eyes were sunken, black pits that seemed to absorb the light. And its mouth was too wide, filled with jagged teeth that didn't belong in any human skull. It wore tattered clothes, frozen stiff with frost, and its bare feet left icy prints on the floor as it moved toward me. I backed away, my flashlight trembling in my hand. "Stay back," I shouted, but the thing didn't stop. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, its head cocked to the side like it was studying me. I bolted up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. Behind me, I heard it scramble after me, its claws scratching against the wood. I hit the kitchen and slammed the basement door shut, shoving a chair under the handle. For a moment, there was silence. Then the door rattled, and I heard that growl again, low and menacing. I didn't stick around. I ran out into the snow, not even bothering to lock the front door. My truck was still running, and I threw it into gear, speeding down the unplowed road as fast as I dared. In the rearview mirror, I thought I saw something step out onto the porch, watching me as I disappeared into the storm. When I got back to town, I reported everything to the sheriff. He listened, his face pale, and then told me to keep quiet. "We'll look into it," he said. But I knew he wouldn't. And even if he did, what could he do? The power outages stopped after that night, but the disappearances continued. People would vanish, their homes found empty, their footprints leading into the snow. And every time it snowed, I couldn't help but think of that thing in the basement and the hole in the floor and wonder what it was digging for. I don't work for the utility company anymore. I moved south, somewhere warm, where the snow never falls. But even here on cold nights, I sometimes hear the wind howling, and it reminds me of that January, of the thing I saw. And I wonder if it's still out there waiting for the next storm. It's funny how the mind tries to block things out, isn't it? After all these years, I still can't shake the memories of that winter. January 2023. A cold that got under your skin, even in a hospital. Most people think of hospitals as sterile places, white walls, and the sound of machines. But I found myself in one that wasn't just cold in temperature. It was cold in ways I never expected. I wasn't supposed to be there. I had an accident. Nothing major, just a slip on ice that left me with a broken leg and a concussion. They told me it'd be a couple of days, maybe a week at most. Nothing to worry about. But in the middle of January, hospitals become something else entirely. The place was practically empty. I remember the quiet. I could hear the echoes of my own footsteps in the hallways as I was wheeled to my room. The nurses, they all looked tired, like they'd been working for days without a break. Nighttime in that hospital was off. I couldn't explain it, but something felt wrong. The silence was different. Sometimes I'd hear people walking down the hall, but when I checked, nothing. It was just me and the soft hum of the machines. But then there were the whispers, not from the patients. No, they were quiet or asleep. The voices came from the staff, talking behind closed doors, always too low for me to make out the words. The weird thing, they'd disappear the moment I tried to get close. I figured I was just imagining things. After all, who could blame me? I was in pain, on meds, alone in a hospital room. Things started to get weirder. I couldn't sleep at all. One night the pain was bad, so I decided to get out of bed, maybe stretch my leg. That's when I saw it. A nurse walking past my door, her eyes darting back and forth like she was looking for something. I tried to call out, but she didn't hear me. She didn't even flinch when I hit the call button, so I just watched as she turned the corner and disappeared. That same night, I heard a sound from the other side of the wall, like furniture scraping across the floor. But it wasn't the typical hospital noise. It sounded like something being dragged. It was odd, though. There was no one else in the ward. I tried to get some rest, but that noise, that dragging sound, kept going. Then I heard a voice, a woman, whispering softly. I thought it was a nurse again, but when I looked, no one was there. The whispers were getting louder, and they didn't stop. Something else happened later that night. I saw her. Well, I didn't see her, but I saw her. A figure crouched in the corner of my room. She wasn't sitting, not like a person would sit, but like she was curled up on the floor, huddled in the dark. Her face was pale, but it was hard to make out anything else. She was just there. I froze. I couldn't move. It wasn't until I reached for the light switch that she vanished. But she wasn't just a trick of the light. I know what I saw. The nurses came in the next morning, but I didn't say anything. Who would believe me, right? Just another patient with a wild imagination. I decided to talk to another patient in the ward later that week. He had been there for a while, longer than I had. I don't know why, but I asked him if he had noticed anything strange. And that's when he told me the truth. Apparently, there was a woman, a patient, who had been in that room before me. She had been suffering from some mental condition, and during her stay, she became obsessed with the idea that people were watching her. Eventually, she disappeared. No one knows how, but she was never seen again. The room? They said it was always reserved for someone new, but the whispers, the dragging, they never stopped. And I realized then, the figure I saw, she wasn't a ghost. She was something else. I never did get an explanation. The hospital insisted nothing strange had happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the place had a history, a dark one. People come and go, but the walls, the rooms, they remember. As for me, I left after a week, got my leg fixed, and never returned. I know what I saw, and I'll never forget it. The whispers, the figure, the dragging. And so, whenever January rolls around, I can't help but think back to that place. The cold, the silence, the whispers. I still don't know if it was all in my head. But I do know this. Some stories don't just fade away. Some things, they stay with you. And that hospital? It's still there, waiting. It was January, the coldest I had ever experienced. I was on a solo trip up to a remote cabin in northern Montana, a place my grandfather used to tell me about when I was a kid. He said it was nestled in a valley where the snow fell like whispers and the stars hung low enough to touch. It was my idea of peace. I needed to get away. Life had been suffocating, and this seemed like the perfect escape. The road was narrow and carved through dense pines. Snowbanks towered on either side like frozen walls. My car, an old Jeep Cherokee, groaned against the biting cold, and the heater worked overtime. I remember glancing at the dashboard clock, 5:13 p.m. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving an eerie, dim glow. I was about 20 miles from the cabin when the first oddity struck me. The radio, which had been playing faint static and occasional country songs, suddenly went silent. I fiddled with the knobs, but no signal came through, not even static, just a hollow, oppressive silence. Then my phone lost signal. Not unusual for the area, but the timing felt off. I shrugged it off, attributing it to the remote location. Still, a gnawing discomfort settled in my chest. I told myself I was just tired. About 10 minutes later, the road ahead was blocked by a massive fallen tree. There was no way around it. The snow was too deep on either side. My heart sank. I had no choice but to clear it. Grabbing my gloves and flashlight, I stepped out into the frigid air. The beam of the flashlight illuminated the tree, and something else. There were footprints in the snow, barefoot, Human. They led from the tree into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. "Hello?" I called out, my breath fogging in the air. No response. The woods swallowed my voice. The tracks looked fresh, like they'd been made minutes ago. Who in their right mind would be out here without shoes in sub-zero temperatures? My instincts screamed at me to get back in the car, but I couldn't leave the tree blocking the road. I grabbed the axe from the back of my Jeep and started chopping, keeping one eye on the woods. It took me 20 grueling minutes to clear enough of the tree to squeeze past. By the time I got back in the car, my fingers were numb despite the gloves. I cranked the heat and drove on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. A few miles later, I saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road, tall, motionless, and wearing nothing but a tattered pair of pants. No shirt, no shoes. Just standing there, staring at my car. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding. The Jeep skidded to a stop about 20 feet away. The figure didn't move. I could see now that it was a man. His skin was pale, almost blue, and his eyes, they didn't reflect the light. They were voids, empty. I honked the horn, hoping to scare him off. He didn't flinch. "Hey, you okay?" I shouted, rolling down the window just a crack. No response. My breath hitched as he tilted his head like a curious animal. Then he smiled. It wasn't a human smile. It was too wide, too wrong. Panic surged through me. I threw the Jeep into reverse, but the tires spun uselessly on the icy road. The man began to walk toward me, slow and deliberate. "Get away!" I screamed, slamming the gas pedal. The Jeep lurched forward, and I swerved around him, barely missing him as I sped down the road. My hands were trembling on the wheel, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I glanced in the rearview mirror. He was running after me, fast, faster than any human should be able to. His limbs moved unnaturally, like a puppet on strings. The road twisted and turned, and I pushed the Jeep as hard as it would go. The man kept pace, his horrifying grin never wavering. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. I didn't see him vanish. One second he was there, and the next, he wasn't. I didn't stop until I reached the cabin. By then, the adrenaline was wearing off, and exhaustion hit me like a freight train. I locked every door and window, double-checking them twice. The fire I lit in the fireplace did little to warm the icy dread in my chest. I told myself it was over. Whatever I had seen, it couldn't have followed me here, but it had. Around midnight, I heard it. The faint sound of footsteps crunching in the snow outside the cabin. Then came the knock. Slow, deliberate. A rhythmic tapping on the front door. I froze, clutching the fire poker like a lifeline. The knock came again and again. I crept to the window, pulling back the curtain just an inch. He was there, standing in the snow, that same twisted smile on his face. But he wasn't alone. Behind him stood a dozen others, all barefoot, all grinning, all staring at the cabin. The knocking stopped. Then the handle of the door began to turn. I don't remember much after that. Just flashes, breaking glass, cold hands grabbing me. The sound of laughter. Not human laughter, but something primal and cruel. When I woke up, it was morning. I was lying in the snow miles from the cabin. My Jeep was gone. My phone was dead. And those footprints? They surrounded me, a chaotic pattern of bare feet in the snow. I never went back. The cabin, the Jeep, everything I left behind. It didn't matter. I don't even tell this story to scare people. I tell it because if you're ever driving down an empty road in the dead of winter and see someone standing in your way, don't stop. Whatever you do, don't stop.